The German officer pressed his boot against Edith Vance's spine, forcing her face into the frozen mud of the courtyard. Snow fell in thick, silent curtains around them, landing on her cracked lips and melting into bitter water. She was 24 years old, and 3 days ago she had been a nurse in a British field hospital near the Belgian border. Now she knelt in the center of a Nazi interrogation camp, surrounded by barbed wire that gleamed like silver teeth in the pale winter light. Her uniform was torn, her dark auburn hair matted with dried blood from where a rifle butt had struck her skull. Soldiers laughed somewhere behind her, their voices carrying through the freezing December air like the cawing of crows. Edith's fingers curled into the ice beneath her, and she thought of her younger brother, William, still fighting somewhere in France. She had promised their dying mother she would keep him safe. Now she couldn't even keep herself alive. The officer, a thin man with pale eyes and a scar running from his ear to his jaw, crouched beside her and spoke in accented English. "You were found carrying documents," he whispered, his breath fogging in the cold. "Maps of our supply routes, names of our commanders. You will tell us who gave them to you." Edith said nothing. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The documents had been sewn into the lining of her nurse's apron by a dying French resistance fighter she had treated 3 nights before the ambush. He had clutched her wrist with bloody fingers and begged her to deliver them to the Allied base in Antwerp. She had never reached Antwerp. Instead, she had walked straight into a German patrol, and now she was here, in this frozen hell called Stalag König, a camp hidden deep in the Ardennes forest, where prisoners disappeared and no letters ever came out. The officer grabbed her chin and forced her to look at him. His pale eyes searched hers, looking for fear. He found it, but he also found something else, defiance. It flickered behind her terror like a candle refusing to die in a storm. He smiled, a thin and cruel expression, and released her face. "Take her to Block 9, he ordered the guards in German. Edith didn't speak German, but she understood enough to know that Block 9 was not where regular prisoners went. Block 9 was where they broke people. 2 soldiers hauled her upright, her boots dragging through the snow as they pulled her toward a long concrete building at the far end of the camp. The windows were painted black. No sound came from inside. Edith twisted her head and caught one last glimpse of the grey sky before the iron door slammed shut behind her, swallowing her in darkness. Inside Block 9, the air smelled of rust and antiseptic, a smell Edith knew too well from her nursing days, but twisted now into something sinister. They threw her into a cell no larger than a closet, with stone walls that wept with moisture and a single flickering bulb hanging from a frayed wire. She collapsed onto the concrete floor and pressed her back against the wall, her breath coming in sharp, painful gasps. Hours passed, maybe days. She lost track of time in the endless darkness. They brought her water once, a tin cup shoved through a slot in the door, but no food. Her stomach cramped with hunger, and her thoughts blurred at the edges. She thought about dying. She thought about her mother's grave in the churchyard back in Kent, the roses she had planted there every spring. She thought about William, his gap-toothed smile when he was 7, the way he had cried when their father left. She would not betray the resistance. She would die first. Then, on what she believed was the 3rd night, the cell door opened. But it was not the scarred officer who stood in the doorway. It was a woman, tall, blonde, dressed in the grey uniform of a German camp administrator. Her face was cold and expressionless, her blue eyes unreadable. She studied Edith for a long moment, then spoke in perfect English. "My name is Commandant Helene Richter," she said quietly, "and I am going to offer you a choice. You can die in this cell, forgotten and alone, or you can do something unexpected, something that will save more lives than you can imagine, including your own brothers." Edith's blood turned to ice. William. They knew about William. The woman smiled faintly, as if reading her thoughts. "Choose wisely, Edith Vance, because by tomorrow morning, your answer will determine whether your brother lives or dies." Edith had been born in the spring of 1919, in a small village called Ashford Hollow, nestled in the green hills of Kent. Her mother, Margaret, was a seamstress with gentle hands and a voice like warm honey. Her father, Thomas, was a soldier who had survived the Great War, but had left pieces of himself in the trenches of the Somme. He returned home hollow, a man made of silences and sudden rages, and when Edith was 6 years old, he walked out of their cottage one autumn morning and never came back. Margaret raised both children alone after that, sewing dresses for wealthy women in Canterbury to keep bread on the table. She taught Edith to be strong, to never show weakness, to protect her younger brother no matter what. William was born with a weak heart, and the doctors said he might not live past 12. But Margaret refused to accept that verdict, and so did Edith. William did live past 12. He grew into a stubborn, bright-eyed young man who dreamed of flying planes and seeing the world. When war broke out in 1939, he lied about his heart condition and enlisted in the Royal Air Force against Edith's desperate protests. She had screamed at him, begged him, even threatened to report his medical forgery. But William had looked at her with their mother's eyes and said, "Someone has to fight Ellie. If not me, then who?" Their mother died that same winter, her body weakened by years of labor and grief. On her deathbed, she had clutched Edith's hand and whispered a single command: "Protect your brother." Edith had promised. She had sworn on her mother's fading breath that she would keep William alive. And now, standing in a frozen Nazi camp with a German woman threatening his life, that promise felt like a chain wrapped around her throat. Commandant Helene Richter led Edith out of Block 9 and into a small office at the rear of the building. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting orange light across the wooden desk and the maps pinned to the walls. Edith stood shivering in her torn uniform, her wrists still raw from the ropes that had bound her during transport. Helene poured 2 cups of tea from a porcelain pot and set one in front of her. "Drink," she ordered. Edith didn't move. Helene sighed and sat down across from her, folding her hands on the desk. "I am not your enemy, Miss Vance. Or rather, I do not wish to be." Her English was flawless, almost aristocratic. Edith studied her face, the sharp cheekbones, the pale lips, the shadows beneath her eyes. This woman was tired, deeply, dangerously tired. "You're a Nazi," Edith whispered. "You are my enemy." Helene's expression flickered, just for a moment, before settling back into cold composure. "I wear this uniform because I must," she said quietly, "not because I believe in what it represents." She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a photograph, sliding it across the wood toward Edith. It showed a young man in a Luftwaffe pilot's uniform, his face split by a wide, boyish grin. Edith's heart stopped. It was William. "Your brother was shot down over Cologne 6 weeks ago," Helene continued. "He survived the crash, but was captured. He is currently being held in a labor camp 80 kilometers from here." Edith's vision blurred with tears. Alive. William was alive. "I can get him out," Helene said. "I can arrange his transfer to a prisoner exchange program. He could be back in England within a month. But I need something from you in return." Edith wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her mind racing. This had to be a trap, a manipulation. And yet, the photograph was real. William's smile was real. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Helene leaned forward, her blue eyes locking onto Edith's with an intensity that made the air feel heavier. "There is a man in this camp," she said slowly. "A high-ranking SS officer named Oberst Victor Brandt. He is responsible for the deaths of thousands of innocent people, Jews, Poles, Romani, political prisoners. He is a monster, and in 3 weeks he will be promoted and transferred to Berlin, where he will oversee the expansion of the extermination programs." She paused, letting the words sink in. "I want you to kill him, Edith. I want you to become his nurse, earn his trust, and end his life before he can murder another soul. Do this, and your brother goes free. Refuse, and he dies in that labor camp. The choice is yours." Oberst Victor Brandt was 53 years old, and he was dying. Not quickly, not mercifully, but slowly, his body rotting from the inside out. A rare blood disease had begun consuming him 2 years earlier, and now he required daily transfusions and constant medical supervision just to stay alive. He had been transferred to Stalag König because it contained one of the only functioning medical facilities left in the Ardennes region. A grim irony that placed the architect of mass death in the hands of captured Allied nurses. Edith learned all of this from Helene on the night she agreed to the mission. She had no choice. William's life hung in the balance. But she also felt something else stirring inside her chest as she listened to the commandant describe Brandt's crimes. It was hatred, pure, bright, burning hatred. She had seen the mass graves. She had heard the stories from refugees who had stumbled into her field hospital with hollow eyes and trembling hands. Brandt deserved to die, and she would be the one to kill him. Helene arranged for Edith to be transferred to the camp's medical wing as a nursing assistant, her identity buried under forged papers that listed her as a French prisoner named Margot Delacroix. The Germans were desperate for trained nurses. So many had died or deserted, and they didn't look too closely at her credentials. Within 2 days, Edith was standing in the sterile white corridors of the medical building, wearing a grey smock and carrying a tray of syringes. Her hands trembled as she walked, but she forced herself to breathe steadily. She had survived the London Blitz. She had held dying soldiers in her arms and watched the light leave their eyes. She could do this. She had to do this. The door to Brandt's private room loomed ahead, guarded by 2 SS soldiers with rifles slung across their chests. One of them checked her papers, grunted, and waved her through. Edith pushed open the door and stepped inside. The first thing she noticed was the smell, a sickly sweet odor of decay, masked by antiseptic. The second thing she noticed was the man lying in the bed. Oberst Victor Brandt was gaunt, his skin the color of old parchment, his cheeks sunken and hollow. Tubes ran from his arms to bags of dark red blood hanging from metal stands. His eyes were closed, and for a moment Edith thought he was dead. Then his eyelids fluttered open, and he looked at her. Those eyes were not the eyes of a dying man. They were sharp, cold, calculating, the eyes of a predator trapped in a failing body. "You're new," he said in French, his voice a dry rasp. Edith nodded, her throat tight. "Yes, Oberst. I am Margot. I will be assisting with your care." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze traveling from her face to her hands to the slight tremor in her fingers. Then he smiled, a thin reptilian smile that made her skin crawl. "Good," he whispered. "I need someone with steady hands." The last nurse was too nervous. She made mistakes. Over the next 2 weeks, Edith learned the rhythms of the medical wing. She changed Brandt's bandages, administered his medications, monitored his blood pressure, and cleaned the wounds that festered on his legs despite every treatment. She hated touching him. Every brush of her fingers against his papery skin made her want to scrub herself raw. But she did it anyway, wearing a mask of calm professionalism while her mind raced with plans. Helene had provided her with a small vial of potassium chloride, a drug that, in high enough doses, would stop a human heart within minutes. It looked exactly like the saline solution Edith injected into Brandt's IV line every morning. All she had to do was swap the vials, and it would be over. Brandt would die, William would be freed, and thousands of future victims would be saved. Simple, clean, justified. But nothing in war was ever simple. On the 14th night, Edith was changing Brandt's sheets when he grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. His eyes bored into hers, and for a terrifying moment, she thought he knew everything. "You remind me of someone," he whispered. "A woman I knew in Poland, a school teacher. She had the same fire in her eyes." His grip tightened. "I had her shot." Edith forced herself not to flinch. "That is unfortunate, Oberst," she said quietly. "Teachers are valuable." Brandt laughed, a horrible, rattling sound that dissolved into coughing. When he recovered, he released her wrist and sank back against his pillows. "You are clever, Margot," he murmured. "I like clever women. They are far more entertaining when they break." He closed his eyes, and within moments, he was asleep. Edith stood frozen beside his bed, the vial of potassium chloride burning a hole in her pocket. Tomorrow, she told herself. Tomorrow she would end this. Tomorrow did not come as Edith had planned. She woke before dawn, her nerves coiled tight as piano wire, and dressed in the freezing darkness of the nurses' quarters. The vial of potassium chloride was hidden inside her shoe, pressing against the arch of her foot with every step, a constant reminder of what she was about to do. She walked through the snow-covered courtyard toward the medical building, her breath fogging in the grey pre-dawn light. Soldiers patrolled the perimeter, their boots crunching on the ice. Somewhere beyond the barbed wire fence, a crow called out, its harsh cry echoing across the forest. Edith reached the medical wing and climbed the stairs to Brandt's room, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain the guards could hear it. But they didn't. They barely glanced at her as she passed. She was invisible, just another faceless nurse in a grey smock. She pushed open Brandt's door and stepped inside. The room was empty. The bed was stripped, the IV stands removed, the curtains drawn back to reveal a view of the snow-laden pines beyond the window. Edith stood frozen in the doorway, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Where was he? Had he died in the night? Had he been transferred? Then she heard footsteps behind her, and a familiar voice spoke. "Looking for the Oberst?" Edith spun around. Helene Richter stood in the hallway, her face pale and drawn. "He was moved to the main hospital in Liège 2 hours ago," Helene said quietly. "His condition deteriorated overnight. The doctors believe he has weeks, perhaps days, left to live." She paused, her blue eyes searching Edith's face. "You were too slow, Miss Vance." Edith felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. "William," she whispered. "What about William? You promised." Helene raised a hand, silencing her. "The deal has changed, but not in the way you fear." Helene led her to the same office where they had first spoken, locking the door behind them. She poured 2 glasses of schnapps and handed one to Edith, who drank it without tasting. The alcohol burned down her throat, spreading warmth through her frozen limbs. "Brandt is beyond your reach now," Helene said, settling into her chair. "But there is another way to save your brother, and to accomplish something far greater than killing one dying man." She reached into her desk and pulled out a thick manila folder, sliding it across the wood toward Edith. "These are the transport schedules for the next 3 months," Helene continued. "Every train carrying prisoners to the eastern camps, every supply convoy moving weapons to the front, every communication route between Berlin and the field commanders." Edith stared at the folder, her hands trembling. "This is enough to cripple the entire Western operation," she breathed. "If the Allies had this information—" "Exactly," Helene interrupted. "And I am giving it to you, but you must deliver it yourself." She leaned forward, her expression intense. "There is a resistance contact in the village of Malmedy, 15 kilometers east of here. A baker named Henri Marchand. He can smuggle you across the Belgian border and get these documents to the Allied commanders. In exchange, I will personally escort your brother to neutral Switzerland. He will be waiting for you there when this is over." Edith's mind raced. It was insane. It was suicide. 15 kilometers through Nazi-controlled territory in the dead of winter, carrying documents that would get her executed on sight. But it was also her only chance. "Why are you doing this?" she asked suddenly. "Why betray your own country?" Helene was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I have a daughter. She is 6 years old, and she lives with my sister in Munich. And I refuse to let her grow up in a world shaped by men like Victor Brandt." Edith studied the commandant's face. The exhaustion, the grief, the quiet determination beneath the cold exterior. She saw herself reflected there. 2 women from opposite sides of a war, both fighting to protect someone they loved. "When do I leave?" Edith asked. Helene smiled faintly, the first genuine smile Edith had seen from her. "Tonight. There is a supply truck departing for the eastern checkpoints at midnight. I have arranged for you to be hidden in the cargo hold. The driver is one of ours, a German soldier who lost his entire family to Allied bombing and no longer cares which side wins. He will take you within 2 kilometers of Malmedy. After that, you are on your own." She stood and extended her hand. Edith took it. The handshake was firm, brief, and final. "Good luck, Edith Vance," Helene said. "And if we never meet again, know that what you do tonight will save thousands of lives, including mine." The supply truck lurched through the darkness, its wheels grinding against frozen ruts in the road. Edith lay curled beneath a tarpaulin in the cargo hold, surrounded by crates of ammunition and medical supplies. The cold was brutal, a living thing that seeped through her stolen German coat and wrapped around her bones like iron chains. She clutched the manila folder against her chest, feeling the edges of the documents dig into her ribs with every bump and jolt. The truck's engine roared and sputtered, masking the sound of her chattering teeth. She had never been so cold in her life. She had never been so afraid. But every time the fear threatened to overwhelm her, she thought of William's photograph, his gap-toothed grin, his bright eyes, and she forced herself to keep breathing. 2 kilometers. She just had to survive 2 more kilometers. The truck stopped without warning, and Edith's heart seized in her chest. She heard voices outside, German, sharp and commanding, and the sound of boots crunching on snow. A checkpoint. Helene had warned her about these, had told her the driver would handle it, but Edith still held her breath as the seconds stretched into eternity. There was shouting, then laughter, then the creak of the truck's door opening. Footsteps approached the cargo hold. A flashlight beam swept across the tarpaulin, inches from her face. Edith closed her eyes and prayed to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. The beam moved on. The footsteps retreated. The truck's engine rumbled back to life, and they were moving again. She exhaled slowly, her lungs burning with relief. 1 checkpoint down. She didn't know how many more lay ahead. 20 minutes later, the truck stopped again, and this time the driver rapped twice on the partition between the cab and the cargo hold. The signal. Edith pushed aside the tarpaulin and climbed out into the freezing night, her legs stiff and aching from hours of stillness. The driver, a gaunt man with hollow cheeks and dead eyes, pointed toward a gap in the tree line. "Malmedy is northeast," he said in broken French. "Follow the stream. Do not use the roads." He didn't wait for a response. The truck rumbled away into the darkness, its taillights disappearing around a bend, and Edith was alone. The forest stretched before her, black and endless, the pines heavy with snow. An owl hooted somewhere in the distance. She pulled her coat tighter and began to walk. The stream was frozen solid, a ribbon of silver ice winding through the trees. Edith followed it as the driver had instructed, her boots crunching through the crusted snow with every step. The moon emerged from behind the clouds, casting pale light across the forest floor and throwing long shadows between the trunks. She moved carefully, pausing every few minutes to listen for sounds of pursuit. There were none, only the wind sighing through the branches and the distant howl of wolves. But danger lurked everywhere in this forest. German patrols swept through regularly, hunting for escaped prisoners and resistance fighters. If they found her with these documents, they wouldn't bother with interrogation. They would shoot her on sight and leave her body for the wolves to find. She thought of her mother again, of the roses in the churchyard, and she kept walking. 2 hours later, she saw lights through the trees, the flickering glow of oil lamps in cottage windows. Malmedy. She had made it. But as she approached the edge of the forest, she heard something that made her blood run cold. The rhythmic crunch of marching boots. German soldiers, at least a dozen of them, moving through the village streets in tight formation. Edith dropped to her knees behind a snowbank and watched, her heart hammering against her ribs. The soldiers stopped in front of a small bakery with a faded sign above the door. She couldn't read the words from this distance, But she didn't need to. She knew what it said. Marchand. They had found her contact. She watched in horror as the soldiers kicked down the door and dragged a grey-haired man into the street. Henri Marchand, the baker who was supposed to save her. He was bleeding from a wound on his head, and he didn't struggle as they threw him to his knees in the snow. An officer stepped forward, drew his pistol, and shot the baker through the temple. The sound echoed through the village like thunder. Edith lay in the snow behind the bakery, her body shaking uncontrollably, not just from the cold, but from the horror of what she had just witnessed. Henri Marchand was dead. Her only contact, her only hope of reaching the Allies, lay crumpled in the street with blood pooling around his shattered skull. The German soldiers ransacked his shop, tearing apart bags of flour and overturning crates of bread, searching for the documents they somehow knew existed. Someone had betrayed the resistance. Someone had told them about the network, about Marchand, about everything. And if they knew about Marchand, they might know about her too. She had to move. She had to find another way out. But her legs wouldn't obey her. She lay frozen in the snow, watching the soldiers through gaps in the wooden fence, her mind paralyzed by fear and grief. Then she saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. One of the soldiers, a young man, barely 20, with blonde hair and frightened eyes, separated from the group and walked toward the back of the bakery. He moved hesitantly, glancing over his shoulder as if afraid of being seen. When he reached the fence, he stopped and looked directly at the spot where Edith was hiding. Their eyes met through the wooden slats. For a long, terrible moment, neither of them moved. Then the soldier did something extraordinary. He pressed his finger to his lips in a gesture of silence, pointed toward the forest behind her, and mouthed a single word. Go. Edith didn't understand. She didn't trust it. But she also didn't have a choice. She scrambled backward through the snow, staying low, and disappeared into the trees. She didn't look back. She ran until her lungs screamed for air and her legs buckled beneath her. And then she collapsed against a pine trunk and wept. She woke to sunlight, filtering through the branches and the distant rumble of artillery. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was or why she was lying in the snow with ice crystals clinging to her eyelashes. Then it all came flooding back. The checkpoint, the forest, the murdered baker, the young soldier who had let her go. She sat up slowly, every muscle in her body protesting, and checked the documents. They were still there, folded against her chest, slightly damp but intact. She was alive. Against all odds, she was still alive. But she was also completely lost, with no contact, no guide, and no idea how to reach Allied lines. She stood on shaking legs and looked around. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, a maze of identical pines and snow-covered clearings. She picked a direction, east toward the rising sun, and began to walk. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, then began to sink toward the horizon. Edith's hunger had become a dull ache that she no longer noticed. But the cold was relentless. She stumbled through drifts and crawled over fallen logs, her strength fading with every step. She thought about lying down in the snow and letting the cold take her. It would be easy, peaceful even. But then she thought of William. William with his weak heart and his stubborn courage, waiting for her in some Swiss village that might as well be on the moon. She couldn't give up. Not yet. She pushed herself forward, one step at a time, until she crested a hill and saw something that made her cry out in disbelief. Below her, in a small valley surrounded by frozen fields, sat a farmhouse with smoke rising from its chimney. And parked beside the farmhouse was a jeep flying an American flag. She half ran, half fell down the hillside, waving her arms and shouting in English. Soldiers emerged from the farmhouse. American soldiers, their faces weathered and suspicious, their rifles trained on her chest. She collapsed at their feet, tears streaming down her frozen cheeks, and pressed the manila folder into the hands of the nearest officer. "Please," she gasped. "Please, you have to take these. Their transport schedules, supply routes, everything." The officer, a captain with a thick Boston accent and kind eyes, looked at the documents, then at her, then back at the documents. His eyebrows rose slowly. "Where the hell did you get these?" he asked. Edith laughed, a broken, hysterical sound, and said, "From a German woman who wants to save her daughter, and from a nurse who wants to save her brother. Please, please help me." The captain studied her face for a long moment. Then he nodded and helped her to her feet. "Get this woman inside," he ordered his men, "and get me a line to Supreme Headquarters. We've got work to do." The war ended on May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, and Edith Vance was there to see it. She stood in the streets of Paris with thousands of other survivors, watching the crowds dance and weep and embrace strangers like long-lost family. The documents she had carried through the frozen forest had changed the course of the war. Allied commanders had used them to intercept German supply convoys, liberate prisoner camps before evacuations could be completed, and cripple communication networks across the Western Front. Historians would later call it one of the most significant intelligence breakthroughs of the entire conflict. But Edith didn't care about history books or military commendations. She cared about one thing only: finding her brother. The Red Cross had been searching for weeks, following a trail of prisoner transfers and medical records that led from Germany to Switzerland, and finally to a hospital in Geneva. And now, as the celebrations raged around her, Edith boarded a train heading south. The hospital was a converted monastery on the shores of Lake Geneva, its white walls gleaming in the spring sunshine. Edith walked through the gates on trembling legs, her heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe. A nurse led her down a long corridor, lined with windows that looked out over the blue water, past rooms filled with recovering soldiers from a dozen different nations. At the end of the corridor, the nurse stopped in front of a closed door and smiled. "He's been asking for you," she said softly, "every single day." She opened the door, and Edith stepped inside. William was sitting in a wheelchair by the window, thinner than she remembered, his face pale and drawn from months of captivity. But when he saw her, his eyes lit up with the same gap-toothed joy she remembered from their childhood, and he held out his arms. "Ellie," he whispered, "you came." She crossed the room in 3 steps and fell to her knees beside him, wrapping her arms around his fragile body and sobbing into his shoulder. He held her tightly, his own tears falling into her hair, and for a long moment neither of them could speak. The war had taken so much from them, their mother, their innocence, years of their lives that they would never get back. But it hadn't taken everything. It hadn't taken this. "I promised Mum," Edith finally managed to say. "I promised her I would protect you." William laughed softly, his chest rattling with the effort. "You did, Ellie. You did protect me. You saved my life." He pulled back and looked at her with shining eyes. "And now, we're going home." 3 months later, they stood together in the churchyard at Ashford Hollow, beside their mother's grave. Edith had planted new roses, bright red ones that blazed like fire against the green grass, and the summer breeze carried their scent across the quiet cemetery. William leaned on a cane now, his heart still weak, but growing stronger every day. The doctors said he might never fly again, but he didn't seem to mind. He had seen enough of the sky, he told her. He wanted to feel the earth beneath his feet for a while. Edith knelt beside the headstone and ran her fingers across the carved letters of her mother's name. "We made it, Mum," she whispered. "Both of us, just like I promised." The wind rustled through the rose bushes, and for just a moment, Edith could have sworn she heard her mother's voice, warm as honey, gentle as a lullaby, whispering back, "I know, my darling. I always knew you would." She never saw Helene Richter again. After the war, Edith searched for months, writing letters to every Allied agency and German reconstruction office she could find. But Helene had vanished, along with thousands of others in the chaos of the collapse. Some said she had been executed by the Nazis in the final days of the Reich, after her betrayal was discovered. Others said she had escaped to South America with her daughter. Edith chose to believe the latter. She chose to believe that somewhere in the world, a little girl was growing up with her mother by her side, in a land without war and without men like Victor Brandt. It was a small hope, but hope was all any of them had left. And sometimes, Edith had learned, hope was enough. On quiet nights, when the English rain pattered against her cottage windows and William snored softly in the next room, she would think of the frozen forest, the moonlit snow, the young German soldier who had let her go. She would think of all the choices that had led her here, the terrible choices and the brave ones, and she would whisper a single word into the darkness. "Thank you." The end. If this story moved you, leave a comment below. Tell me your favorite moment. Tell me which character touched your heart. And if you want more stories like this, stories of courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable human spirit, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because there are so many more tales waiting to be told.